Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Vanessa and I'm an author from Toronto, Canada, and I publish under the pen name A and Sage. I write magic, mystery, and a lot of mayhem, and on this channel I provide tips for other authors on things I've learned along the way of having published 20 books so far and counting. I am also a book coach and author coach, and so everything that I can do to help and any advice I can provide, I try to put it on this channel. We also do a lot of planner videos, plotting videos. I review tech and gadgets and different types of tools that authors and writers can use in their journey in publishing. And with that said, today we have a video that I think is pretty important, and it's actually stemmed from a comment and a question that somebody, a viewer, had on another video that I posted where I talked about how to break down cozy mystery beats, and the question was about writing hooks. Now, I've been meaning to do a video on hooks for a while, but I think it's important to talk about it and give you some tips that I have when it comes to not just hooks, but also writing that first page, because the hook is usually in the first chapter. It's not the only chapter you might have a hook in, but we'll talk about that later. But you usually want to hook your reader pretty immediately. And that hook often happens in the first page, if not the first line. So let's talk about some tips for writing a hook that gets readers to want to keep reading and want to get into your story, gets readers to connect with your characters and to connect with you as an author. So the first tip should come as no surprise, and that is your first line. Your first line is so important. It is the thing that sets the tone for your story. It's the thing that will probably hint towards the theme of your entire book. And it's also the first interaction that your reader has with not just with you, but with your character. So first lines are immensely important for getting the reader in. They're not the most important thing, I don't think, but they are very, very intricate and very important to the plot. And so when you're writing your first line, you want to think of something that is gripping. You also want to think of a first line that kind of sets the tone for the book. So if your book is darker, your first line should be a little bit more ominous. If your book is a rom-com, then you kind of want maybe a funny first line, something that tells the reader exactly what they're in for. There's a lot of famous first lines out there from different really big books. And so if you want to Google that, I'm sure you can come up with a whole bunch of really great first lines to use in examples. But the first step to getting over a great hook is that first line. Now, another tip for writing a good hook is you want to set up an emotional connection. So you really want to have some kind of connection with the reader right away, and that connection should be emotional. So if your reader can feel what your character feels without you telling them, so showing versus telling is very important for emotional connection. If there is a sense of dread, you want your reader on edge, right? Because you want them to be like, what's going to happen? I really need to know. If there is more of a, let's say, a happy feeling that the book will genuinely have, and the theme of the book is like achieving some sort of happiness, maybe your emotional connection is that the character is not quite there yet. So you kind of want to play on the emotional connection of your characters having not reached their goals yet, or doing the opposite, because at the end of the book, you want the reader to root for your character and for them to achieve their goals, obviously. And so that emotional connection has to be very, very evident on the first page. And that means that your reader has to feel what your character is feeling. The best way to do that is to describe what's happening around them. You want to talk about what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what their body is doing. So the physicality of the body sets a really good connection with the reader, and it's an intentional connection, because if you describe what the character's body is doing, chances are the readers can relate to that because they have bodies too, and our bodies pretty much all do very similar things when they are reacting to something. So take a look at things like that and really get your reader on board with that emotion. Don't be afraid of action. That's the next tip. Don't be scared of having your first page, your hook, be action. You don't need to just go through the motions of what the character is going. It doesn't have to set up anything. You can literally just start a first page and the first line of your hook with an action. Your character, if it's, let's say you're writing a detective story of some sort, your character could be mid-beat down by a bad guy. And that's the action you're writing. You could have a magical action if you're writing a fantasy. Maybe there's a chase scene, right? So things like that are really, really important. Think about how your reader can, again, going back to that connection, but now maybe we have a physical connection to the character. So maybe your reader is getting excited because there's excitement on the page, right? Something is happening, something physical is happening, some kind of fast act is going on, and it's happening either around your character or to your character. So don't be scared to use action in your first page. A lot of times, having that first page, that kind of hook chapter, is fast. It's incredibly fast, because that is what gets your reader on board. They already feel like they are reading. They feel like they've read some of the book already, because you started them at a point where things are actually moving along. And so they don't feel like they need to read, like 30% of the book to really get into it. A lot of times, you hear people's reviews, didn't get into it until 30% in, but then I was really on board. Well, maybe that's where your first page starts, right? Is where they're already on board. Then the next tip is to make sure that your reader has questions. This is probably the most important one, is you want to leave the reader with some questions. And the reason you want to leave them with questions, and not answer everything, is because you want them to turn the page, right? You have to promise them that you're going to answer those questions later. And so giving the reader some questions of what's going to happen next. Will your character survive this? Will they save that family member? What's going to happen to that person they just passed by on the street, and they were really into, but then they didn't talk to again? Will they talk to them again? Will they develop their magical powers and save the world? Like, all of these questions need to be kind of put forward. I just wrote a first page for a book that I'm working on, and this is the thriller that I'm working on, and I'm not going to give anything away. I'm not going to talk about this book too much because I'm kind of like in the middle of it. But the first page for that book, and kind of the hook part of that book, is a woman who has lost her twin brother when they were young kids to maybe possibly paranormal circumstances, maybe not, we don't know, questions. But she sees him, she's convinced she's seeing him on a subway train. This is the first page, is her seeing him on the subway train. I'm not giving lead up to what happened. I'm not telling the reader what's going on, because I want them to have those questions. I want them to question if this person is really her brother. I want them to question, how did the brother die? And I want them to question what happened to get this woman from point A to point B to where they are right now. So all of these are very, very important questions to have. And I answer some of them, but not all of them. And that's another tip we're going to talk about in a second. Your next thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that your character's voice is brought up on the page. So you need to make sure that whatever your character is going through, that it comes across on the page. And that means that you need to work out your character's voice before you start writing your first page. You need to know your character. You need to know their tics. You need to know what kind of language they would use. Are they more casual speaking? Are they highly educated, and so they sound a little bit more intelligent and pretentious sometimes? Do they look down on people? Because of that, maybe. Do they question their motives all the time because they're unsure of themselves? This is kind of the exercises you want to do about your character and getting to know your character. And we can do a full video on getting to know your character. I know I've done one for plotting before, on developing character and character voice and all of that, but we can actually do like a more refreshed video for characters maybe this month. That's something I can talk about as well. If you want to see that, make sure you comment and let me know. If you want me to do a video on just developing character voice and developing like rounded characters, comment below and let me know if that's something you want to watch sometime soon, because I need fun topics to talk about too. But yeah, so you want your character voice to really come across on the page. Your readers should feel like they already know your character from literally the first like 2 sentences that they read in your book, your main character. It's really not just your author voice, because that will come across as they read, but the main character, whoever is centered on. So develop your characters until you're basically bleeding from the eyes, and then start writing your book on your first page. Your next tip that I have for you is you want to introduce a problem, right? It's similar to give the readers questions to have. You want to give them a problem that you're introducing that you're going to solve throughout the book. And so if they think there's a problem or a conflict or hints of a conflict, is there like a political conflict that's happening? If you're writing a dystopian, say, book, the conflict could be the character getting from point A to point B without interference or whoever else is there. And so like just there should be some kind of conflict that you know you're going to solve or solve throughout the series, if not in the particular book, but that should be evident in your hook chapter or your first page. Now, going back to the problem that you're introducing, you want to thrust your character into that conflict. Don't tiptoe around the main conflict of the book. Don't kind of drip reveal it. That's what you want to do with your world building, with magic systems if you have that, with the character's past, with their trauma or any kind of personal issues that they might have with their relationships. You want to drip reveal those throughout and not info dump those. But the conflict, throw your character right in there. Don't be afraid of your character having to deal with something negative or something strange or something scary right in that first page, because that really, it not only goes back to introducing a problem, getting the reader to have questions, but it also helps you develop that action that we talked about. And so thrusting your character into your conflict, putting them right in the middle of it, could work really, really well, especially if you're doing it on the first page in those first 3 or 4 paragraphs. Then I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but if you have your manuscript already ready and you've written a big portion of it, try to read forward a bit. See if when you read forward, if there is a point somewhere that might make a better start, a more rational start and a more gripping start, because maybe you don't need all the build-up. So a lot of times we tend to overwrite our build-ups to the start. You want to slowly get your reader into your world and to get to know your characters and all of the stuff, and even some of the stuff we've already just talked about for the hook. But sometimes the part that like basically encapsulates the entire hook of your book might not be happening until chapter 3. And you've written the first 2 chapters as kind of like a prelude to where your book should really start. So an exercise I really like to do is I will read through every single chapter. I will go through chapter and I will tell myself, if I started here, am I losing anything? Does this make sense? Like rationally, am I losing maybe just one thing that I could later shift into a later part in the book and it still makes sense? Or does it not make sense to start here? And I kind of do this for the first couple of chapters or even for the first couple of pages, if it's not full chapters. And then I can see if the answer is yes, then I scrap everything else. It's kill your darlings. Sometimes it's okay. I know, just, mourn them a little bit, but just delete, put it in a folder somewhere. Think about it later. But sometimes that's the starting point, right? You might have not started at the right place. You might have not started at the place where your hook in your story actually lives. And tip number 9, we're almost there because I've only got 10 and then a quick bonus one. But tip number 9, don't info dump and avoid descriptions. Lengthy descriptions have absolutely no place in your hook chapter or your first page or any of that. None of that hooks the reader. It might be very cool to see how well you can describe the color of a tree or how the wind blows between its leaves. But I can tell you right now, not just as an author, but also as a reader, if I'm reading that and it's the first page, I'm not reading the rest of that book. It makes the reader become stagnant in your plot, in your story. And so avoid those descriptions, avoid info dumping about how your world is structured. They don't need to know that right away. It's better if they don't know it and they have questions about your world and magic system, if you're writing fantasy and all of that and what happened and how did we get here. That is much more interesting for a reader to have questions, to have something that they don't know yet, instead of reading basically a history of your world. So descriptions, info dumping, take that out. We don't want that on the first page or the first chapter, definitely not in the first line. And then going back to the questions, because I did mention that the questions and having questions is the most important part. So my final tip is you want to answer some of the questions. I know it's counterintuitive because we want them to have questions, but thrillers actually do this really well. Thrillers and mystery do this very well because every time a question is answered, a new question is often introduced. And so the reader is always guessing. They're always trying to figure out what happens next, who did this, why did that happen? So there's constant questions that are being introduced as other questions are being answered. And so the reader always feels like they're just on the brink of figuring things out and figuring out your story and your book. And then you throw some more questions in. And so and this was probably more for the first chapter, maybe not so much for the first page, although you could do it on the first page if you really work at it. But introduce a question pretty much right at the beginning. Answer that question somewhere towards the end and introduce another one. And so you kind of want to be on this constant hamster wheel of questions coming up, answers being given, more questions coming up. If you think of your entire book this way, I can guarantee you your reader will be on a wild ride with you. And I think that is exactly what's going to make it so gripping. And then the bonus is you don't have to add your hook in just the beginning, right? You could have more than one hook. I know. Shocking, but you could have a hook for your middle. You can have a hook somewhere else. You can have a mini hook in every single chapter that will keep your reader guessing and wanting to move forward. So as just an exercise for yourself, try adding a small little hook into every single chapter as you write it. You can always take it out, but try to figure out what's going to get the reader to turn the page. Do you end it with a question? Do you end it with something shocking happen? Do you end that chapter with a big action that is unresolved? Cliffhangers. Cliffhangers are great hooks. So your hook doesn't necessarily have to live in just that first page in the first chapter. You must have a hook because you want them to keep going, but it doesn't just have to happen there. It doesn't end there. You can have as many hooks as you want as long as they make sense to the story and they keep it moving forward. So hopefully I answered our viewer question of how to develop hooks, how I develop hooks, how I think about hooks in general, and how I kind of structure them and how I plot them out. And a good way to do this, as always, is to sit down, get a piece of paper, because I'm a paper gal, or digital notebook, whatever you're using. Write down a bunch of questions that might come up for the rest of your novel. So things that you are answering in your novel, write questions for every single answer that you're going to have as the story goes on, and see which ones of those questions you can put into that first hook page and that first hook chapter. And so I can guarantee you, if you look at all these questions that you might have, one of those questions is probably the hook for your book. It's probably the shortest way to get your hook in your head if you can't think of what the hook for your book is. So when I was working on, let's talk about the thriller just because I've already talked about it before. So when I was working on that and I was trying to figure out what the hook for my thriller would be. And so I sat down and I wrote down all of the questions that I'm planning to answer in the book. And one of the questions that really stood out to me is the protagonist guilty? And that really stood out to me because it made me realize that I'm writing this book from the perspective of a protagonist and a lead that might not be someone we can trust. They might be the murderer. They might be the ones that did something to her twin brother. And so that to me was the question that needed to remain unanswered. And that was the hook for my book. The thriller is a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, but told in thriller form. And so the hook basically for the whole novel was, is Gretel guilty? Is Gretel the real witch? So that was kind of the idea for the book, where I've seen kind of takes on these stories before where Hansel and Gretel were not necessarily the good guys, where the witch was actually the good guy, where what would happen if they didn't make it, all these different takes. But I haven't seen too much play on the fact that maybe only one of them was bad, because they're twins, right? And so that play, the duality of the twins, was very interesting to me. And so that's something that I really wanted to play with, that connection. And I also wanted to shatter it in many, many ways, which I'm not going to talk about now because that's going to give away a lot of the book. But the whole idea of twins and family and that close relationships that get torn apart was very important to me in this particular book. so that was my question. And when I listed out like all of the questions about like what happened to her brother, where did she grow up, is there a real witch, is there paranormal influences here, all of that stuff, I had them all on a piece of paper. And the one question that really stood out to me was, did she do it? And so that's the question, and that's the hook for the main chapter. And so when I read that first page and I let a few people read it, most of them, pretty much, no, actually all of them, asked that question where they said, I want to know if she did it. And that means I did my job in explaining the hook. And now they want to know and they want to keep reading. And that was really important. So just an exercise you could do just to figure out what the hook is. So hopefully that helped. And again, as I mentioned before, first of all, thank you for being a part of this community. I can't believe how fast we're growing now. We're getting more and more subscribers pretty much like every day. And I'm just... I'm in shock. I'm so excited that these are helpful, and I love hearing when a video has helped you think of something, or it helped you figure out like a tool you want to use or something. If you have ideas for tools you want me to try, any kind of tech, make sure that you know that in the comments, because I'm always down to review new things and get them and pick them up and let you guys know how I feel about them. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching till the end if you're still here. And as always, stay magical, and I will see you next week. Bye.